When you looked at the Miami Dolphins heading into 2016, even though I had picked them to finish second in the division, that wasn't really saying a whole heck of a lot. This was not a team that on paper looked like it really had it together. This was not a team that you really held any playoff aspirations for. Even though they had hired Adam Gase, who was a very hot commodity as an offensive coordinator, that next head coach of the future type of dude. You're talking about a team where Ryan Tannehill had yet to really truly establish himself, that he had that type of dude factor. And Ndamukong Suh was coming off of a disappointing season in 2015 after the Dolphins had paid him a shit ton of money. The Miami Dolphins allowed Olivier Vernon to leave via free agency. Same thing with Lamar Miller. They replaced Vernon with Mario Williams. You just look at this team and you just sit there and you say, where is it? And what is there to indicate that this is anything other than a mediocre to bad football team? So a lot of questions about this Dolphins team heading into 2016. And early on in the season, they looked like they were kind of a mess. You had Jay Ajayi getting suspended because he didn't take being benched in favor of Arian Foster very well. The team starts 1-4. And it looks like it's going to be a very, very rough go of it year one for Adam Gase. Maybe a 4-12, 5-11 type of season, and maybe year two is where you start to look at some growth and progression. But then a funny thing happened. This team figured it out, and they kind of started to come together. After that 1-4 start, they won 6 straight, and even once Ryan Tannehill went down with injury, the Dolphins were something to deal with during the second half of the season. They end up finishing 10-6. They end up making the playoffs in the AFC as the number 6 seed as a wild card. And just that right there was a huge accomplishment. You lose your starting quarterback and you still make the playoffs. You started 1-4 and finished 10-6. Think about that for a second. This is a team that went 9-2 in their last 11 games. They played some really, really quality football when it mattered, and really made something out of it. Now, it helps when you got a guy like Jarvis Landry. Think about that receiving core at LSU back in 2013 with Jarvis Landry and the kid named Odell Beckham Jr. No wonder Les Miles got fucking canned finally at LSU. You can't win with talent like that on your team. What the hell is wrong with you? And while Jarvis Landry is not Odell Beckham Jr., Jarvis Landry is still a dude. He's still got some stud factor to him. Just a reliable, tough type of wide receiver that you can really count on when he's on the football field to surprise you and make some big plays. I mean, he's not that explosive type of number one wide receiver, and I know he plays a lot out of the slot, but he is still a guy that you could feature as a number one type just because of how solid of a route runner he is, the fact that he's pretty solid after the catch, and the fact that he catches almost everything thrown his way. But the real kind of godsend for this organization in 2016 had to be Jay Ajayi. Talking about a guy who I didn't really quite understand in 2015 why he lasted until the 5th round. I know there was some talk about a knee injury, but he was a guy, if I remember correctly, I had like a 2nd-round draft grade on. I really, really liked him coming out of Boise State. And when he got his opportunity in 2016, he made the most of it. And he really was an impact player for the Miami Dolphins. He really changed the Miami Dolphins season. You're talking about a guy, and while he only rushed for a little over 1,200 yards, you got to look at the fact he wasn't a full season starter. He had 3 games where he rushed for over 200 yards. And if I remember correctly, there was a back-to-back stretch of 200-yard games. That's 3 200-yard games in a season. There are some great running backs, Hall of Fame running backs, that never had 200 yards in a game. This guy had 3 of them in one season. Unbelievable. And the blocking in the running game was not always the best either. That's what I thought was so impressive about Jay Ajayi's 2016 season. And while he wasn't going to be an MVP type of guy, I thought he had as much value to his team as just about anybody the second half of the season, because he just changed the dynamics of everything that the Dolphins were able to do offensively and defensively. And with all the positives that came out of this 2016 season, it still ended in disappointment, like it does for 31 teams in the NFL. If you don't win the Super Bowl, it ends up being a disappointing season. It can still be a positive, but it still leaves you with a bitter taste in your mouth. And for the Dolphins, they made the playoffs, but they lost a road playoff game to Pittsburgh. They frankly never really were in it. The Steelers jumped down their throats early, and that pretty much was that. But at the end of the day, you had some injuries in particular. You were going in without your starting quarterback. How much did you really expect him to be able to do? But again, there was definitely progress and huge progress. And I thought Adam Gase really flew under the radar as a coach of the year candidate. Because it's one thing for a Dan Quinn to do incredibly well with somebody like a Matt Ryan. It's another thing for a guy like Jack Del Rio to do really well with Derek Carr and Khalil Mack and Michael Crabtree and Amari Cooper. You look at his Miami Dolphins team, though, Adam Gase didn't have that. So to me, when you talk about Coach of the Year candidates, he belonged right in that conversation because you can clearly see the impact of his coaching as the season progressed. Now, heading into this offseason, there's reason for some hope in Miami. Not saying they're a championship contending team, but they're not. But you had a solid first year under Adam Gase. Now you start to think about what do you have to do to close the gap in that division between yourself and the New England Patriots? And that has to be part of the goal this offseason. It doesn't mean that you're able to completely close the gap in one offseason. And frankly, based off of the fact that Belichick's the greatest head coach in NFL history and Tom Brady's the greatest quarterback in NFL history, as long as one or both of those guys are still in the mix in New England, I don't know if anything ever does change. But the Miami Dolphins right now are the best position to potentially give the Patriots a run in that division. In terms of this offseason, they got over $40 million in salary cap space. So they've got some money to spend. Will they re-sign guys like Kiko Alonso? Who knows? They've already traded for Julius Thomas, traded away Brandon Albert. So it'll be interesting now. You would assume Laramie Tunsil will kick out to left tackle, their 2016 first-round pick. Julius Thomas comes in and maybe in a better system, on a better team, with a better coach and a better quarterback, maybe you get something out of Julius Thomas that at least occasionally reminds you of what he used to be able to do with Peyton Manning in that Denver offense. Maybe it doesn't. But I understood the approach of what they were trying to do there. Now, they don't have a ton of money to sit there and go hog wild in free agency, but it would probably behoove them to try and get one or two guys, one or two starters on the defensive side of the ball in free agency, hopefully and preferably some speed and talent in the linebacking core and the secondary. But with that said, you don't want to be a team that goes too hog wild in free agency. Now, granted, you just re-signed Cameron Wake, or redid his deal, and that was great. Even though Wake is about 35 years old, he's still a stud. But now you have to sit there and get better. You have to improve, and this team does have some needs. I look first on the defensive side of the ball, and in this draft, the good thing for them is this is a really good draft in terms of pass rushers. And the Dolphins need a young pass rusher. They need a young defensive end that can play opposite Cameron Wake and eventually take over for Cameron Wake. If anything, you could argue that they need to draft two defensive ends pretty early in this draft, two edge rushers pretty early in this draft. Because at 35 years of age, how much longer is Cameron Wake actually going to play and play at a high level? And what's the depth behind him? Not very good. They could also use some real talent in the linebacking core, similar to teams like the Giants and the Lions. I think this has been a gaping void in their defense for many years now. The Dolphins, at some point in time in this draft, have to address linebacker, and it's a solid linebacker class this year. Middle linebacker, outside linebacker, they could use some help, and at some point in time, I would expect them to do so. With the trade of Brandon Albert and the eventual shift of Laramie Tunsil to left tackle, this team's going to have a needed offensive guard. You're going to want to address that at some point in time too, because you got to be able to protect Tannehill. You got to be able to open up a little bit better of holes in the running game for your stud running back Jay Ajayi. They could use some speed and talent, I think, at the safety position, and I think they could also use a young tight end in what is a really good tight end class. Because even if Julius Thomas comes in and plays well, there's nothing illegal about having two tight ends that can play. And if Julius Thomas doesn't play well, then you're going to need somebody that is able to come in and take over and make some plays. So when I look at this Dolphins team, they're heading in the right direction. They've got a ways to go, and this offseason will be important in terms of what type of steps they take forward or backwards in 2017.